G'day legends, I hope that you're doing well. Now, this video is actually going to be a mix of today's video and actually yesterday's, as I did do a video yesterday, but due to waiting for some confirmations and actually some mapping, I didn't end up actually releasing it. So I apologize if there's a mix of shots of different clothing and maybe some different angles. But I think I've also been able to remedy my battle with YouTube for being restricted. As you know, I've been restricted over the last maybe 2.5 weeks. Now, hopefully I don't hit any more issues, but because it does have a huge impact on myself and my content. But today we're going to discuss tanks Wagner Group may be operating in other areas of Ukraine and possibly a solution to Ukraine's ammunition and vehicle shortages. As well as last night, there was reported strikes and videos of multiple glide bombs against Avdiivka and drone strikes against Dnipro and Kiev. And also many were shot down. Sadly, a fighter pilot from Ukraine was killed intercepting one of these drones. Now, we will have a look at the map. Now, as always, we have Ukraine in the center with the capital of Kyiv. The red indicating occupied territory since 22 and purple since 14. Over here we've got Romania, Poland, Belarus, and Russia around here. So the front line, as far as the mapping, has somewhat come to a bit of a stalemate over the past week, as conditions are not optimal for armoured movements. And with Ukraine's offensive looming, I think Russia's almost gone into a bit of a defensive posture. Now, the ISW do state, though, that Russia is increasing the deployment of conventional formations along the entire front line and continues forming new volunteer battalions throughout the Russian Federation. So where we're going to look at first is Bilohivka. So down in this direction here. And you can see that in this area over the past 24 hours that Ukraine was able to take some territory. So this was the 26th and then the 28th. This is the most up-to-date map, although I'm in the US, so it will say 28, so a day behind. But this area has been moving backwards and forwards under Ukrainian and then Russian lines. So if we go back just over a week, we will see that's where Russia was, and then Russia managed to move up, and then they've been pushed back to somewhat their original positions in this area. Now, well, let's have a look also at Avdiivka while we're talking about it. So here is Avdiivka on the latest map. And last time what we saw was Ukraine managed to get some area on this side of this main road. Now, how's that been looking? Let's go back to the 24th, and then let's go back between this map and today's. What we see is the grey zone increase a little bit, and we see down to the southwest of Avdiivka, Russia do push slightly out here and also on the north. And it has been spoken in large that Russia is pushing more and more in Avdiivka with some gains. And of course, these maps are never going to be super close. And later on, we'll discuss if there has been Wagner fighters in Avdiivka. Now, let's also have a look at where the fiercest fighting currently is happening. Well, between here and Avdiivka, it is just unbelievably insane. But we'll have a look in Bakhmut, and this is where we'll compare the maps, because somewhere like this is the best area to compare the maps, as it does show some differences as we go. So on the 26th and then up to the 28th. So let's do that again. You can just see that it is now closing up on this eastern edge past the Bakhmutka River, and this encirclement is showing more and more tight on the front line around this region. And what we have been seeing over the past couple of days is Russia and Wagner Group having success on the south of Bakhmut. So if we step back to the 23rd, so over a full week, there has been some level of success here. But as we know now that they've entered into these zones that are completely built up cities or landscape, although a lot of it has been somewhat flattened by artillery, that these offensives do slow down. And Russia has absolutely had problems with not only manpower but also their guns in this area, and Ukraine has chosen to reinforce a lot of these positions. So let's have a look on the ISW map and show what is similar. The ISW is showing very similar on the southern edge, if not maybe even a little bit more deeply in here. So it's showing maybe more up across in this region here. And then we'll have a look on the live UA map, which in my opinion is definitely nowhere near the most accurate map and is very conservative towards Russian gains, although in some areas it's not conservative at all. So just to take that as an example, look at Avdiivka here. Now this map is typically very conservative towards Russian gains. They're saying they're well past this road and pushed right up into here. Where if we have a look on any of the other maps, including Russian maps, sadly I don't have a Russian map today, it is showing nothing similar. So it's very funny to see because it's showing definitely two different pictures, because on the other maps it's showing this area all the way up in here is absolutely under Russian control, especially in the north as well. And Bakhmut has said the important thing here was to clear the industrial zone, which on this map is in the wrong spot, is to the north. So the Azov industrial area is up in here. At the plant itself, you can practically say that has now been done, with the guys finishing off fighters there who are only left in solitary groups. Now, this goes in line with some of the information that I've got from my friends there, that there are units and people trapped in some areas. So we've seen over the past couple of months that Wagner forces were able to break the stalemate both in Bakhmut and Soledar with territorial successes. And although taking huge casualties, they have moved that Russian front line further across. Now, are Wagner fighters in Avdiivka as being reported? Well, Prigozhin has stated that no Wagner forces are in Avdiivka and that you shouldn't believe anything that's coming out of Ukraine. But the ISW has something different to say. So the Institute of War, the ISW, says Russian military leadership likely committed limited higher quality Wagner Group elements to the offensive on Avdiivka, potentially to reinforce recent limited tactical successes in the area. Ukrainian Tavrisk Defense Forces spokesman Colonel Alexei stated on March 25th that Ukrainian intelligence forecasts that Wagner may appear in the Avdiivka direction. A Russian VK user posted an obituary on March 26th announcing the death of Wagner Group fighter Yevgeny Molgtin in Avdiivka on March 20th. The obituary claims that Molgtin had prior military experience and fought the 2nd Russian Volunteer Detachment of the Army of Republika Srpska, commonly referred to as the Bosnian Serb Army, in 1992. Molgtin appears to have been a seasoned fighter and likely represented the higher caliber of fighter that comprises Wagner's Special Operations Forces. Now, we know from people we've spoken to that within Wagner, the quality of the soldiers goes 0 to 100. There are conscripts chucked in and thrown at the front line, told to march towards a machine gun, all the way up to guys who are very competent operators with very good equipment and good ISR behind them. While Wagner has heavily committed a major conflict-based force on operations near Bakhmut, there is likely a contingent of high-quality operators at various locations in Ukraine. Russian military leadership may have decided to deploy certain Wagner elements to the Avdiivka area in recent weeks to support exhausted and lower-quality DPR elements in their forces to take the settlement. If such Wagner fighters have been fighting near Avdiivka, their involvement may help explain the limited tactical gains we've seen over the past week. So a lot of new armoured vehicles have arrived in Ukraine, and as we know, and it's been discussed a lot though, is tanks are not obsolete, although some people will point that they are. If they were obsolete, then we wouldn't see this success on the battlefield, Ukraine wanting tanks and the West still having a lot of tanks. And tanks aren't obsolete in the same way digging a hole in the ground with a shovel is not obsolete against artillery. But what we've seen is the British Challenger 2 tanks arrive, the German-made Marder fighting vehicles, the German-made Leopard tanks, and the Striker fighter vehicles. Now, in this photo, doesn't include the Leopard tanks. Germany is delivering the Leopard 2A6, which is a very modern variant in the family of Leopard 2 tanks. Now, Poland is also delivering some, and they've delivered at least 4 at this point, and we believe that Germany is delivering 18 of these. Now, we have some newer numbers about these tanks, and as always, just take these with a grain of salt, because we've seen a lot of equipment turn up in larger numbers and fewer numbers than sometimes we have previously seen reported. So Portugal over the last 24 hours has delivered 3 Leopard 2A6 tanks. So the Western equipment that I'm tracking on this most recent was up to 14 Challenger 2s from the UK, 21 Leopards, 18 from Germany, I think, the 3 from Portugal, the Forta Marder 1A3, the infantry fighting vehicles, and 90 strikers. Now, these numbers are far lower than that amount promised, but we will continue seeing a lot of this equipment flow in, like the Leopard 1s and some more Leopard 2 from some other places, and different variants. So I said Leopard 286, we'll see different variants of those Leopards come in as well. What the sort of the big news of this is the British Challenger 2s. And we know that only yesterday it was being reported that the training for the Ukrainian soldiers on the Challenger 2 was completed in the UK, and they're heading back to now man these vehicles and use them on the front line. One of the uphill battles of all of these vehicles from different origins and different variants will be actually keeping them up to date on the maintenance. Now, former Ukrainian officer and analyst at the Center for Defensive Strategies has said the happiness from the fact that they're giving us tanks is a little bit eclipsed by the great difficulties in maintaining them in fighting shape. We cannot do it by ourselves, and at least in the short term, the overall success of these vehicles could absolutely come down to how they can actually be maintained. Ukraine has a lot of vehicles, a lot of different variants, and these vehicles are very different. For example, the British Challenger 2 has a lot of its own supply and maintenance issues. It has a rifled 120mm barrel, which differs from the smoothbore of the Abrams and the Leopards, meaning they have to use a different type of ammunition. This is why we're seeing a lot of countries purchase equipment from other places and replace it because it's easier to do. And what could be a big one is what we're going to talk about in Bulgaria. Absolutely, these tanks do give a weapons overmatch to the majority of Russian tanks, especially the most commonly used ones like the T-72, T-80s, the T-90s. There is some questions there. The T-14, we have not seen it deployed in the battlefield, and we believe that it has not been produced in enough numbers to then be used. And also as well, that if it is used in battle and does not, come up to where the scratch of where it should be, that export of that vehicle may then be limited. The export of some Russian variants has come into question as these tanks have underperformed all across the line. At the end of the day, with a lot of these modern tanks, it doesn't matter T-90, Challenger, Leopard, whatever. It comes down to the crew, the training, and the communication the crew has to them, the information the crew has available, and the overall battle space awareness in that tank and how it is used in battle. We saw a lot of Russian tanks killed in the beginning of this war, which were completely sacrificed due to a lack of command and control. But when will we see these in battle? And realistically, we are unsure when we'll first start seeing these Western tanks actually in battle. Now, we do know the conditions for an offensive are absolutely not ideal, with particularly the amount of mud. So we're not really sure, but we know that it has to be within the next coming weeks, and realistically, it could be any day that we start seeing these vehicles on the front. And I think once we start seeing these vehicles on the front, we can assume that that is the beginning of the Ukrainian offensive. But will we see them in the east? Will we see them in the south? We're unsure, because these tanks are still in somewhat limited numbers. Once we see these Western tanks actually go into battle, it will be very interesting to see how they fare. All things are pointing that they should be very successful, but a lot rides on this. And if these tanks were to underperform, there will be a lot of questions asked, as currently it seems the offensive is somewhat hanging on the back of these new vehicles. And if they do underperform, how would that look, and would support change? But also the UK is sending 30 of their AS-90 SPGs, which are their self-propelled guns. These are 155mm artillery system, and the training has also been completed along with the Challenger 2 training, and these are now coming into Ukraine as well. But we do know that there is a worldwide shortage, at least now, which can be overcome with the military industrial complex and creating more. But right now there is a shortage of this 155mm ammunition. But this has shown the West that, relatively this is not a massive war. It's confined into one country involving two countries, which this isn't like a world war. It's shown, the West that, look, if we rolled into something where it was multi-nations across borders through the Pacific, through Europe, we would need a lot more of this stuff. So the production of 155 is not only kicking up for Ukraine, but it's kicking up for more storage throughout the West as well. France announced that it intends to double the number of 155mm shells manufactured then delivered to Ukraine, bringing them up to 2,000 a month. Economy Minister Bruno Le Maire says Paris will deliver ground equipment necessary for Ukraine's counteroffensive. We are thus doubling the delivery of 155 shells to bring it to 2,000 per month, starting from late March. So starting from pretty much now. And also you need to remember they're using a lot of these shells as well, especially once they go on the offensive. Ukraine's been in a very defensive mode for the past few months. It's got offensive, they'll use a lot more. Now, NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg has said Ukraine currently uses 4,000 to 7,000 artillery shells per day against Russia's 20,000. Now, people say, oh, well, 2,000 for using 7,000 a day is not going to keep up with it. Well, of course, but not all of that is 155mm. There are a lot of other variants of artillery out there as well, but we do know that currently Ukraine is using more of this 155 and more of some other artillery shells than we are actually producing currently, bringing a lot of questions into if the West went into a war, how long could we actually sustain our guns? And has raised a lot of questions around the world of how long could we sustain our guns, fuel in the vehicles, diesel for tanks, things like that. At the end of the day, it has opened up a lot of holes that the West has had in its own forces. And this is why I've seen countries like America or Australia and all this absolutely bump up our defence budgets and start stockpiling more stuff or producing to stockpile. Although it is said that it could take a decade for some artillery stockpiles to actually be full again. To actually be full, leaving it in somewhat of a funny state. Talking of logistics, how logistics can be used in a war. Myself, serving Australian Army, it has always been sort of widely known that if a major player such as China were to invade the north of Australia, our goal would be just to bound from the north to the south, because the southeast is where the majority of the Australian population is. And by the time that those countries even got to those big centres, not only would we be able to hit them guerrilla warfare style on the way back, but they would have to go through, 3,000-4,000 kilometres of desert potentially just to get there. And the logistical demand of this, fuel trucks, vehicles, amphibious landings, would just be so massive that it would be incredibly hard to do. And this is why logistics and keeping up on this stuff can have the biggest effect on the outcome of these wars. Now, we're also seeing move around. A lot of people are drawing comparisons between this as Ukraine gets some of the most modern Western tanks that we've seen Russia moving around on trains, 70-year-old T-54 and T-55 tanks. Now, there's a lot of speculation about that these are going to be reconditioned and sent to the front line. Now, these tanks absolutely will not stand up to a Challenger 2, an Abrams, a Leopard. But my thinking is they're not going to be used for that. They're going to be used as makeshift artillery in defensive positions. As Russia know, and they've talked about a lot, that Ukraine is going to go on the offensive soon. And at the end of the day, yes, it's old. Yes, it's 70, 80 years old. The gun on it is from, really dates back to World War II, although we have a lot of weapons in the Western Army that date back that far as well. But at the end of the day, it is still a maneuverable armoured box with a large gun on it. And it's going to need a very expensive and close range, at least by person, anti-armoured weapon to take that out. And this is still a formidable challenge on the battlefield for any ground troops. And Russia has these tanks in massive numbers. And this is not out of the realm to use these tanks not as, a tank you'd imagine cruising around, but used as artillery. So in 2020, the territorial war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Azeris deployed at least a company, about a dozen T-55 tanks near the disputed district of Agdam. Now, these were used as howitzer sort of artillery, whilst their newer T-72s worked on direct assaults into Armenian positions. So it's definitely doable. And a lot of people will bring up the question of the accuracy of these and the barrel life. As we know, the barrel on a tank does not have the same life as the heavier barrel on an artillery system, and the accuracy is not the same over the amount of range as well. That said, in a lot of this close fighting is direct fire, so you're just firing directly at something, and accuracy for a lot of what we've seen throughout this conflict isn't a massive concern for Russia, with in some areas taking up a scorched earth method. But as this war turns more and more into a war of attrition and artillery is the king of the battlefield, it's not only who can produce the most amount of shells and artillery, but also then get it onto the front line and actually get it used in the fight. But something that isn't talked about as much, but is incredibly important, is barrel life. And these barrels wear out very quickly. So an M777, which is a towed howitzer, which is the American, Australian, really one of the most common 155mm howitzers used, has a barrel life, they say, of about 2,500 shells, which realistically isn't that much in a large-scale conflict like this. America has burnt through these barrels before. So the US Marine Corps, in artillery support of US-backed forces fighting in the Syrian city of Raqqa, burned out the barrels of 2 of their M777 howitzers during an effort to liberate the city. So it's definitely something that can happen. And we've had so many reports, and I've reported on this a lot, about Russia burning through these barrels and trying to conserve the barrel life on their guns around Bakhmut. Whilst they're still firing, they're limiting the range, because the more propellant and the heavier the shell you put in any of these artillery systems, it means the faster it starts burning out that barrel. And I don't know what the West has in place for the replacement of any of these Ukrainian barrels on the weapons that they have given. As we know, some of these artillery systems were delivered, at least not with the complete suite of which we would deliver a weapon to our front line, meaning with the drone, with some of the other systems along with it. You can hear about that in my interview with Soldier X, talking about artillery sent from Australia. That said, at the end of the day, an artillery barrel is still something that can be produced fairly easily. I know it's a lot more complex than this, but at the end of the day, it is a rifled tube. It's not, some fighter jet, not some massive piece of technology. It is a tube. We know Russia and the West and Ukraine can make lots of this, but getting it to the front line, replacing it, and then getting it back in the fight, the logistics of a war like this is everything. People have said, referring to these shells, that as far as shells, Russia is a millionaire and Ukraine lives paycheck to paycheck. Bulgaria could help Ukraine out in a tight spot. Now, Bulgaria was never actually in the Soviet Union, but was closely out and was one of the most loyal satellite states to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and is often referred to as the 16th Soviet Republic rather than an independent country. But Bulgaria has definitely distanced themselves from the Russian Federation. Now, Bulgaria has huge stockpiles of Soviet equipment and, most importantly, huge stockpiles of ammunition. Now, this is greatly needed in Ukraine, as large amounts of equipment is still being used from the Soviet era. So not only can this be implemented with no training, it also fills gaps of ammunition shortages. Being reported that this will be sold through intermediaries, which really is a person who acts as a link between people. We've seen this before as well. The Defense Russian Ministry announced that it would transfer old ammunition worth nearly 175 million euros to the state military plants VMZ, and in return will receive new ammunition. Now, former Defense Minister Bakhmut has said this is the largest rearmament of Bulgarian land forces in recent history. That's a huge amount of ammunition, hundreds of thousands. There are huge increases in the prices of ammunition, and the VMZ will sell this ammunition through intermediaries to Ukraine. This is an amount of ammunition that could turn the tide of the war in some directions on the Ukrainian front. But that's all I've got for you guys today. So if you want to support me, the link's down below. But otherwise, never feel obliged. Look after yourselves, and I will speak to you over the next couple of days. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.